Welcome back, James.
Thank you.
We're into our next segment on the Old Testament, and today we're talking about the book of Exodus, which is, I know you may not be able to see him quite well in the video, but that's why we have Moses accompanying us today. This is our Moses bobblehead to watch over us as we talk about the stories that he had a great deal to do with in the book of Exodus. So let's get started. First question is this one, James. What's Exodus about?
Well, that's a good question. Exodus is, it's about God keeping his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and through Joseph. It's about God redeeming his people. In fact, you could say that's the theme of Exodus, is redemption. It's about God giving his law through Moses, the great lawgiver. And it's about God dwelling with his people in the tabernacle. In fact, Exodus ends in chapter 40 with a beautiful picture of the erection of the tabernacle, and then God comes and dwells there in the midst of his people. That's where Exodus leaves us. In the beginning of Exodus, they're in bondage, and at the end of Exodus, they've been delivered, and God is dwelling in their midst. It's a beautiful picture.
Absolutely, it is a beautiful picture. And right in the middle of that picture is this interesting character, Moses. He's just, he's dynamic because he's not perfect. He's got his flaws. He's got his struggles. He's a great character to unfold the story of God in Exodus. But my question to you, is Moses the main character?
Well, yes and no. It's interesting. Moses is a huge figure in the Bible. In fact, people like to build their Mount Rushmores of such and such. You know, what's your Mount Rushmore of the greatest whatever? And you could say that Moses is on the Mount Rushmore of Old Testament characters. You got Abraham, you got Moses, you got David, you got Elijah. And they loom over the entire Old Testament. And Moses is the main character of Exodus in a sense, but not if you look back at it from the perspective of the New Testament. Because when you look back at it, Christ is the main picture, or the main character. He's pictured throughout. We see him all over. Right. The book of Exodus.
Okay. Well, just to whet our appetite a little bit, to encourage people to read through, what can someone expect as they're reading through Exodus? Can you give us maybe a 3-minute or so highlight of the high points of Exodus?
Maybe.
Okay.
Exodus.
You're on a time.
Exodus is one of the most interesting books of the Bible. It's some of the most compelling action that takes place in the Bible is in the book of Exodus. In fact, if the Bible, if the Torah, the Pentateuch, weren't divided up into 5 books, you wouldn't really know that you had changed books just by changing over from chapter 50 of Genesis. You would think, well, here's chapter 51 of Genesis, because it just picks up right where Genesis 50 left off. God's people are in Egypt, and the first couple of chapters tell about them in Egypt, how they're being oppressed, and how God begins to deliver them through Moses. And we have the wonderful, famous story of Moses and the ark and the bulrushes, and how he's drawn out by Pharaoh's daughter, and then how he's raised up in Pharaoh's household, and he kind of discovers who he is. And then through some circumstances, some have conjectured that perhaps Moses on his own was going to try to deliver his people from Egypt. But he's driven out into the wilderness, and then he meets God in the burning bush, and he's sent back to deliver the people. And there's this great contest between Moses and Pharaoh, but the real contest is not between Moses and Pharaoh, it's between Yahweh God and the gods of Egypt. And of course, the God of Israel, the God of Moses, is victorious over his enemies. He delivers them out of Egypt. And so there they go along about chapter 12, or I think chapter 12 is the is the Passover. Chapter 13, chapter 14, you're going through the Red Sea, and you get all the way to Mount Sinai in chapter 20. And then Moses goes up on the mountain. He receives the 10 Commandments. And then he receives a couple more chapters of law and some instruction. And then something interesting happens. God says to Moses, God almost interrupts himself and says, Moses, you better get down there. Because see what your people are doing. And then Moses goes down there and finds out that they've actually broken the commandments that they had just affirmed that they would keep in an oath. They've already broken them. They've made a golden calf, and they have said, this is the God that brought you up out of Egypt, and they've worshipped it. And Moses actually takes the stones, the I guess granite or whatever.
Tablets?
The tablets written with the 10 Commandments written on both sides with the finger of God. He takes them and breaks them in his anger. He chastises the people. And then he prays. There's a wonderful, wonderful couple of verses there where Moses tells the people, let me go to God in your behalf and see if I can make atonement for your sins. And then he offers himself to God in their place. God, blot out my name out of your book for their sins. And God turns him down. But in that he prefigures Christ, who actually does come and offer himself to take God's punishment on himself so that God's people can be forgiven. It's a wonderful picture. And there's, a couple of chapters there. And then along about chapter 35, Moses goes back up on the mountain and he receives the instructions for building the tabernacle. And then they build the tabernacle. There's an offering. People freely give an offering, and they build the tabernacle. And it ends there with God dwelling in the tabernacle and his presence in the midst of his people.
Okay. One of the things that a lot of people have struggle with, as they're reading Exodus, is this trouble with Pharaoh. There are several occasions in the book of Exodus where God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he won't let the people go. The whole point is so that God would have his people be free, and yet he hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so as the argument goes, then doesn't that seem unfair? Why does God harden Pharaoh's heart in the book of Exodus?
Well, Paul says in Romans 9, it quotes, in fact, God in the book of Exodus, for this purpose have I raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be exalted throughout the whole earth. Pharaoh was a vessel of wrath for God to demonstrate his wrath on. And that comes across as unfair to us, or unjust. How could that be just for God to do that? And that would be true if Pharaoh were good to start with, or even if he were neutral to start with, but that's simply not the case. Pharaoh is a sinner. He's a wicked, rebellious against God, the king, who...
and in this sense, even presumed himself to be God.
He presumed himself to be God. And so, oftentimes you'll see that as part of God's punishment for those who rebel against him, is he hardens their hearts further against him, so that he might really demonstrate his wrath on them. It's a punishment for previous sins. But understand that when God hardens someone's heart, as you're reading through Exodus, sometimes you'll read, and Pharaoh hardened his heart against the Lord. And then you'll read, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then you'll read, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And it goes back and forth. And you say, well, which happened? Well, it was both. And God hardens Pharaoh's heart in the sense that though that grace that God would have given to restrain Pharaoh from going as rebellious as his heart would normally take him, God pulls those restraints back. And God acts in such a way as he knows, because Pharaoh is wicked, Pharaoh will respond by hardening his own heart. So Pharaoh is completely culpable for for his hard heart.
Okay. It's like God letting Pharaoh off the leash, huh?
Yes, in a sense. And that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
A dog's on a leash, and if he could get off that leash, he would bite your leg. But God's got him on the leash, and what God does is just unleash him.
Yeah. Okay, toward the end of the book of Exodus, there's this great description of the tabernacle, but sometimes people get bogged down in it because it is incredibly detailed and incredibly descriptive. Why does God, through Moses, spend so much time describing the detail of how to construct the tabernacle?
Well, because the details were important. And don't be discouraged by that. It's only about 4 or 5 chapters. And the details were important for those people because God was almost meticulous in the way that he wanted everything done. And that's because everything done in the tabernacle points forward to Christ. And you can look at the details and you can see that when Jesus comes in the New Testament, he fulfills those details. He is the living embodiment of all of the details in the tabernacle. And so God is preparing them even in a subliminal way that if they're used to the worship of the tabernacle, when Messiah comes, they will recognize him because they'll see him. So all of those details are important. It tells we don't, as sinful creatures, we don't presume to offer God our own worship that we make up on our own. We wait for God to tell us how we are to worship him. And so when God does that, we make sure we follow that in detail. God is the offended party when it comes to his relationship with us as human beings. We've offended God. And so if God begins to make that relationship with us, and we just say, yes, sir. This is the way we'll do it, even if we don't fully understand why. But, as I said, in the New Testament, those things are revealed.
Yeah. It's all pointing forward to Jesus.
Yes.
Oh, that's a good lead in. Then tell us about the different places in Exodus where we can see Jesus, where we can find Jesus. Often when we think of the Old Testament, we don't immediately jump to Jesus, and maybe we should, but point out some places in Exodus where we can see Jesus.
Well, I've already mentioned one where in chapter 32 where Moses prefigures Jesus offering himself up to God as an atonement for the sins of the people. And there are several others. For instance, Moses is a picture of Christ in the sense that he is the great deliverer of God's people. Moses delivered them from Egypt. Christ came and delivered us from sin and death and from the curse. So we see in Moses a picture of Christ. But we also see Christ in the Passover lamb. Mm-hmm. They were to take the lamb into their home. And then after the lamb had been in their home, it had to be perfect, spotless, without blemish. Couldn't have a bad foot, couldn't limp, couldn't have any problem. It had to be a perfect lamb. And then they would take it and they would offer it up as a sacrifice to God. Sprinkle the blood on the doorposts of the house. And then it's interesting, even the details in the Passover supper of them, of being told not to break one bone of the lamb while they were eating it, whatever, not to break a bone. And the New Testament writers in the Gospels point to this and say that this was pointing forward to Christ. Remember when it came time to break his legs on the cross to make sure he was dead, he had already died. So he didn't have to break his leg. Not a bone of him shall be broken. And so he's pictured